would like to introduce, as I said, my friend and colleague and philosophy guru Andrew, who's here on history today. Thank you, Andrew Collier.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes, you can. I can hear you can hear me. Start off apologising, as it says in the newsletter. This talk actually initially was just an ordinary talk, and then I spent the summer preparing it, and it's turned out to be 3 hours long. And that is what I will be delivering to the history group after Christmas. And we go through all the bits and pieces that I don't go through today as well. So if you want to know more about this lot, then come to history in the new year. In the meantime, I want to use this one. I can just keep talking. I'm used to sort of talking into it. I want to use this one to just explain a few things. The main date is the date of the presence of the presidency. And if you're not aware, as far as presidents are concerned, they are elected in a leap year or an Olympic year, and they take office at the beginning of the next year. For the first half century, they took office, for the first century, they took office in the spring. Nowadays, they take office in January. So you're quite used after every leap year, January afterwards, you have a lovely inauguration, if it's a president you like, and a rather less lovely one if it's the present one, about whom I shall be saying absolutely nothing. The little dates in brackets, and this is where with the history group I do play games occasionally, those are the life dates of the guy concerned. And of course, the whole point of dates is that they tell you something. Those dates tell you how old George Washington was when he became president. They also tell you that he died 2 years after giving up office. So there's all sorts of little bits and pieces. So when I am beginning to bore you stiff with what I do decide to tell you, because I can't tell you all of it, you can tell yourselves little bits and pieces. In the bottom left-hand corner of each slide, you can tell yourselves which states joined the Union in those dates, in the course of that guy's presidency. This is the exception, because there you've got the 13 which were already in, which were there from the start. But you will see that in the second year, Vermont joined. In the third year, Kentucky joined, and in 1796, Tennessee joined. So we moved from 13 stripes to 16 stars, if you see what I mean. Right, that's by way of introduction. Oh, the other thing to draw attention to is that I shall not be talking here about the light blue. The black is what I'm talking about. So again, if I'm boring you and you want to know a little bit more detail, you can have a look at the light blue. But I shall not be talking about that, because otherwise we will be here for 3 hours, and I'm aiming not to be quite as long as that. Okay, George Washington, first president, victorious general. He is the guy, he was in charge of the American side of the War of Independence. He really helped them to win independence. He then retired back to Virginia, where he came from, and hoped that it was all, he'd done his bit, but he was then called upon, and it was his duty, he felt it was his duty, and he is an honourable, conscientious, in many ways, all this stuff about his not being the non-liar, Father, I cannot tell a lie, I did it with my little chopper. That was cutting down the cherry tree, and it's all sort of part of a mythology. A bit of a stick in some ways. He didn't want to be president. He certainly refused any offers to be king. He didn't like the titles, excellency, and all that stuff. He was, as these early people were, extremely principled. It is hard to escape the fact that they were great men, They're involved in a very exciting mission. They're doing something completely new in world terms. And the other thing I want to draw attention to is the date in which Washington became president. They had won the war in 1783. It took them 6 years to sort out a constitution and set up the new presidency. What's it all about? It's about 13 separate entities, each of them. In those days, you didn't see yourself as an American. You saw yourself as a Pennsylvanian or a Connecticut person or whatever it was. The 13 combining together a pluribus unum, one into many, one country. And the conflicts and the issues for the first, well, forever really, it's still there now. If America is reluctant to take on and accept government interference in everyday life or government running things, they don't have a welfare state in the sense, because that's interfering government. And why don't we want interfering government? Because we are still from Massachusetts as well as American, from wherever it may be. And that is in the background. I hope, in the course of this, I hope I give you a few things to think about. Right, 1789, he became president in April. 1789, in July, you all know what happened. The French Revolution. And the world could never be the same. The world could never be the same after this lot. And that's in the background of the French Revolution. But in strategic terms, America is starting just as Europe changes forever. And the issues of Napoleonic Wars, the issues of being after the French Revolution, are sort of implicit in a huge part of the whole story. Okay, so what did I want to say about Washington himself? I just seem to have jumped straight to his farewell address. His farewell address is a great document. He warns them against the party system. He sets the tradition that 2 terms is enough for any president. And for 150 years, it was. And it is again now. It's now by law. The one exception I hope we shall come to. Incidentally, if I don't get beyond Jefferson and it's time to stop, I will stop. But I'm aiming to get through. If I did stop around about the middle of the 20th century, most of you can probably remember the rest of the story, but anyway, we'll see. Okay, have I done it? He was very anti-party split. He did not like the idea of political parties. There's nothing he could do about it. By the time he'd finished, there were already political parties, although the candidates to succeed him were not standing on party tickets. That all came a bit later. And the other thing was that he didn't want overseas alliances. So he became president in the year of the Revolution. By the time he ceases to be president, Europe is already going round and round in the Revolutionary Wars, which are going to become the Napoleonic Wars. And America has, each of these early presidents, has a decision as to whether to get involved or whether to keep out. And the tradition of keeping out goes back to here. So all sorts of things have been established by George Washington. Next president, not a lot to say. Both the Adamses, this is the first Adams, his son's going to come up in a minute, both of them contributed an enormous amount to the foundation of America and were very important. Slightly sadly, neither of them is hugely important as presidents. His contribution to the founding of the United States of America is huge. His contribution as president is somewhat less. I don't think he was a great president. I think he was a great man, and a lot of what he did in getting America off the ground was very important. But as president, we haven't got a lot to say. There's a growing friction, and one of the big frictions I've already referred to is between states' rights and the rights of the central government. And that goes right through American history and is still there. He also, I just really said, he's one of the ones who managed to keep America out of the European wars. If I was doing the full works, I would mention Alexander Hamilton, a far greater and more important figure than half the presidents who I'm going to skip through. A very big figure, and you can go and see the musical at huge expense, because I haven't seen it yet. Huge expense and a huge waiting list for tickets. But Hamilton is a very important figure. Jefferson, another extraordinarily great man. This is the third president. He's been there from the start. The father of the Constitution, the father of the Declaration of Independence, a brilliant man in terms of his writing, a bit of a sort of Leonardo da Vinci, really. He did his own, that house is his, he's an architect. He does his own. Extraordinarily affluent, of course, and like Washington, like most of them, a slave owner, basically in modern terms, in 2020-odd terms, disgraceful man, but in the terms of the times in which he lived, a very great man. His first presidency, well, I've said, under Washington, he was Secretary of State. He's in charge of foreign policy. The Louisiana Purchase, that is, they bought half of the southern states in America for $11.2 million, and they paid some of Napoleon's debts. These were French possessions, and joined the party. And you'll see in the next few slides in the bottom left how these, when they become American property, they become a territory, and it takes time to cease to be, for a territory to be turned into a state. So, great man, Jefferson. On we go. We're still with the founding fathers. Madison had more to do with the writing of the Constitution than anybody else. The Constitution at the time was, and part of its problem is probably that it was such a great, such an impressive, such a revolutionary, carefully worked out balance of powers and all the rest of it, a brilliant document. Such a brilliant document that it's become sort of hard to change. I think that might be fair to say. So, trade issues, all sorts of trade issues. It's very difficult to trade overseas, and America's had to. I mean, this is a new country, and the people it's going to trade with are its former owner, now its sort of enemy, but do we like the French Revolution? Are we having revolutionaries? All the presidents so far are what you might call aristocrats. They are pretty affluent, from sort of ruling classes, so they're not going to be totally in favour of all new French ideas. So anyway, he kept out. He also, as well as the Louisiana Purchase, they grabbed West Florida from Spain. So we're now down the whole of the East Coast. Do we mean the East Coast? Yes. Under Madison, we had the first American war, the Naval War of 1812, we call it. It's a totally unnecessary war. By the time war was declared, as far as they were concerned, they declared war and they started a war. In London, a peace treaty, the terms of it had all been settled. But they didn't know that, so they started fighting. At the end of the war, they didn't know that the war had finished until they were carried on fighting, because communications across the Atlantic, under the Atlantic telegraph wasn't working particularly well then, or maybe it hadn't been invented. But anyway, this was a totally unnecessary war. It was sometimes known over there, where it was very unpopular, as Mr. Madison's War. And it's the fighting bits, which I'm not supposed to be looking at. Basically, way down London, in New Orleans, the burning of the White House and other little conflicts which go down as sort of in the story of history, but it was the unnecessary war. Monroe. We're now into slightly less, there's less tension. The politics are a little more friendly for a little while. The Monroe Doctrine was largely drawn up by Quincy Adams, the son of a previous Adams. So Quincy Adams was a bigger figure than he was president. I've got nothing to say about his presidency. I have a little bit to say about Monroe's. We have this better feeling. We have a thing called the Missouri Compromise, which is already the issue of slavery is becoming an issue. And the compromise is that the states south of Missouri can carry on owning their slaves, and the others will not. So and the Monroe Doctrine, if you've not heard of the Monroe Doctrine, it's very important in European history, and yet the Americans at that stage, the Monroe Doctrine tells the Europeans to keep out of the American zone. And ever since then, the Monroe Doctrine has said, Spain, get out. France, nothing to do with you. Britain, good heavens, you don't still think you've got anything to do with us, do you? So that's the Monroe Doctrine. Andrew Jackson rates very highly in the Americans' own image of their list of presidents. He's a bit of a one-off. He's the first, he's a hero from the Civil War, from the War of Independence. He's a hero for fighting the Indians, which is an issue I haven't mentioned yet, but sorting out the Indians, sorting out the Native Americans, in a way which, again, probably doesn't go down too well in 2020, but at the time they thought it needed doing, and he's really at the heart of doing it. And his attitudes are at the heart of doing it. He's more of a patriot than a politician, I've said there. He's also, and that I am not supposed to be saying the light blue bits, he's the first humble legend. Part of the mythology of a lot of American presidents is that they came from nowhere and got to the top in a way which Her Majesty didn't quite achieve, because they were not born great, they achieved greatness. Several dilemmas. One of them is the first time we have an issue of nullification. Carolina did not like some of the tariffs, some of the customs duties that were being introduced. Carolina said, we will withdraw from the Union of the United States. Jackson said, you are not allowed to. So the idea of nullifying, pulling out, became counter to policy. It's not to be allowed, and that's hugely important in the next few slides, that you're not allowed to withdraw. He stopped it from being an issue because the tariff that they didn't like was withdrawn. But it's the first test, this idea of nullification. We will not accept, we as a state will not accept, was tested there. The other thing, Jackson stands out as being a sort of a turning point for various. The other thing there is that the dealing with the Indians reaches its height and is sort of dealt with. The Native Americans are confined to west of the Mississippi. The Supreme Court said you can't do that, but it happened, and most of the Native Americans ended up on the other side of the Mississippi. And the way that things were happening, of course, is that disease weakens, and in whole masses of Native Americans succumbed to the diseases that the white man was bringing into America. The other thing there was that Jackson denounced the growing abolitionism. Abolitionism means the abolition of slavery, and Jackson, more probably for political reasons, said it was not keen on letting the idea of abolition divide their country. Right. I'm not really going to say very much about any of these. Martin Van Buren had probably done quite a lot before he became president. He is significant. This is where I said I've offered to give you little quiz bits and pieces, where he's, as a quiz bit and piece, he's the first non-British background. He's of Dutch background. He actually spoke Dutch, so his English was his second language. He's answerable, he's the first president to cope with a major economic depression. So he's, in the end, deemed to be a bit of a failure. It's nicknamed Van Ruin, or Van used up man, poor old Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, probably considerably more distinguished than his record. William H. Harrison, very definitely more distinguished than his record, because, his dates have disappeared. Well, his dates have to be 1841 to, 1841 to, that's right, his dates are 1841 to 1841. He lasted 3 months before he died in office. He's actually the shortest president of the lot. The other thing that I have put in black there is that the election, he's a war hero, he's a hero from the Indian Wars. So, huge number of American presidents have a military background and victories to their name and get chosen for their popularity as successful generals. He's one of them. At the election, it is the first election to really go crazy in the sense that you might recognize a modern American election. The razzmatazz. The slogan was, for this war hero, his nickname was Tippecanoe, which is his big battle. So it's Harrison, Tippecanoe, and Tyler too. So Tyler is his vice president. Just a word about vice presidents. An awful lot of vice presidents chosen to balance the ticket. So you've got a northerner standing for the presidency. We'll have a southerner for the vice presidency. We've got a liberal radical for the presidency. We'll have a slightly more traditional. So getting the balance. It is unusual. Think about Sarah Palin. Did anybody really think that she was going to be a possible president of the United States? Well, she was going to be a heartbeat away. And again, the vice president is chosen for this balancing reason and not necessarily the most suitable. Tyler's not particularly unsuitable. He made considerable contributions in their foreign policy, which include sorting out the border stuff with Canada, which has never been quite settled. It's not finally settled now. It includes the expansion and trade with China and trade with a new area in Europe. Germany is not yet a country, but it is by now beginning to be a federation, and trade with Germany comes onto the scene. So trade with other parts, new trade areas for America. And the annexation of Texas. Texas is, well, so I'm not going into full detail here, but Texas had been Spanish. Texas had become independent. Texas is, there are bits of it, Mexico had been Spanish and so on. So anyway, we grab, although we don't turn it into a state yet until 28. What? No. Florida and Texas became states in 45, taking the number of states up to 28. Right? He's a quiz name. He's actually one of the, in a run of presidents who I'm not telling you much about, he's rather a good one. He gave himself 4 aims, and he fulfilled them all. His aim was to regain control of the banks. Another of the ongoing controversies in American history is whether the national bank, the Bank of the United States, whether we're going to have one for a start, because that's a measure of nothing to do with the states. So if you're from Massachusetts, you didn't want a national bank, you wanted a Massachusetts bank. And that's an ongoing issue. So he regained control of the banks. They lowered tariffs, and they acquired, and this was a big one, They acquired California, so they've actually reached the West Coast finally. And they also acquired the green area in the top left-hand corner, which is going in the end to include Oregon. We've now completed coast-to-coast America. They're not all states yet, but it all belongs to the United States. So he gave himself 4 goals, he achieved 4 goals, and he died within a few months of giving up the office, having refused to accept a second term. We'll run through these. Zachary Taylor died within a year, or in the second year of his term of office, and was succeeded by his vice president. His vice president is this man, Millard Fillmore, and they are followed. So a rather little boring run. If you want to know more about them, you can look them up, or you can come to history next term. James Buchanan is the only bachelor. A bit like some of the others, he had been rather a successful politician before he became president. His presidency is completely overshadowed by events. It's, from his point of view, rather sad. I've said there, he'd been under Polk, he'd been the Secretary of State, he was in charge of foreign policy. He had been hugely instrumental in the acquisition of... He had been... You're right. He'd been important in the... in expanding the United States. Then I gave a little note there, the antebellum era. We look back from the Civil War, which is about to take place here. We look back on the previous 30 or 40 years and consider how it could have been prevented, how these compromises on the issue of slavery have failed, how the failure to face up to the difficulties has been sort of procrastinating and postponing it, and it's reached a stage where there's only one way of dealing with it, and that is civil war. So poor old Buchanan, by the time he's finished, the war has it has started. By the time Lincoln's election clinched the Confederacy, the South, they seized Fort Sumner before Lincoln became president. When Lincoln became president, he had to be smuggled into Washington for his own safety, and the issues were all there. Now, in my book, he is one of the greatest. He's another of the log cabin to White House crew. He was self-educated, extraordinarily humble, became a very successful lawyer. He came to national prominence in the debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which took place on the issue of slavery during Buchanan's time. The Civil War was already underway, prompted by the fact that he had been elected. And the start of a civil war is when the southern states seized government property in Fort Sumner, and that is Fort Sumter, and that is the start of the problem. It is quite important to understand with Lincoln that his priority was not about slavery. He was an abolitionist, he was hugely anti-slavery, but the Civil War was fought about the issue of keeping the United States united and telling these southern states that they did not have the option of pulling out, they had to stay together. You can tell that to Nicola Sturgeon next time you meet her. So the actual emancipation which took place during the Civil War, the emancipation of the slaves was actually a military tactic. It was done for military reasons. Lincoln wanted to do it. He'd always wanted to do it. He wanted to abolish slavery. But he hadn't gone to war to abolish slavery, he'd gone to war to keep... to get inside Lincoln's character, this ordinary man, this backwoodsman I strongly recommend, this is a sort of, if you don't know enough about Lincoln, then there are two biographies. One was the one on which the film was based, or which the other, which I found hugely, is by Gore Vidal, and it's just called Lincoln. And if you're looking for a good read and an understanding of this very great man, read Gore Vidal's Lincoln. So, he was in charge of, when he became president, starting at the beginning, each of those people, Seward, Chase, Stanton, several others, thought they were bigger men than Lincoln, who was just a little country bumpkin, had somehow accidentally fallen into it. Seward in particular, if you'd asked at the beginning of Buchanan's time, your next president was likely to be Seward. He was a great man in his own right. But by the time Lincoln was shot, each of these superior, cleverer men with bigger ambition and bigger expectations than Lincoln, each of them has acquired a respect for the country bumpkin. And that is part of the achievement of Lincoln. It is, of course, the worst war in terms of casualties, in terms of new weapons, in terms of the number of losses, lives lost and casualties, the worst war yet. And from America's point of view, it is still the war in which they lost more men than First, Second World Wars or Vietnam. Civil War was far and away the most expensive in terms of lives and bloodshed. It should have been a warning to everybody of what the First World War was going to be like with the new weapons and the inability to grasp the tactics, where the main tactics are, if we've got more men than you, we can outlast, so we eliminate them, wipe them all out, and we'll still be there and you'll be gone. That war of attrition. The great speech is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. He won the 1964 election. He won re-election, a second term. And his speech there, with malice towards none, with charity for all. The big thing with Lincoln is the hope. Who knows, because he didn't do it. But the hope that the reconciliation between North and South would have been a great deal more successful had he lived. Anyway, he's shot in the theatre. His rival in that war was one of the generals. He's ditched McClellan. Get inside into it. Some people here know a great deal more about the Civil War than I do, but Lincoln's greatness and the problems of finding good generals are huge. Anyway, he's assassinated. Stanton, his Secretary of State for War, is the one who said, now he belongs to history, and everybody saw it as being a grim moment. On the same day that Lincoln was killed, Seward was also attacked. That is not widely known now, but Seward, who'd been who was the Secretary of State, had he not, he might have made a better successor. He's not the vice president, but he could have done a better job. Anyway, he's not completely out of action because, as we move on, under Andrew Johnson, Seward is still there. Johnson is chosen. He was actually from Tennessee, and he's the only one of the southern states' senators to stay with the Union. So in a peculiar way, all the other representatives of the southern states and Confederacy, the top politicians, have all gone with the Confederacy. He stayed with the Unionist side. So his reward in the end was to be candidate for the vice presidency for Lincoln's second time around. And the country's reward was to get a second-rate man when the president was assassinated. Am I making sense there? Yeah, I hope I am. It's the first time we've had impeachment proceedings. He was impeached twice. The first time failed fairly widely. The second time, which was about sacking Stanton, who's Lincoln's Secretary of State for War, the one who failed by 2 votes. He came very closer than anybody, actually, to being impeached, because we have never quite completed the process. We've had Watergate, and we'll come to some of the others if we ever get there. So he tried. That we call the rebuilding, we call it the period of Reconstruction. He tried. To me, it's fairly clear that Lincoln would have done better because Lincoln had the clout to push it through. He was very clever at getting things through, Lincoln. Anyway, it wasn't a success. But then at the bottom there, just to remind you that Seward, another of the great men, was still around. He acquired Alaska. They bought Alaska from Russia for $72 million. Quite a lot of land in Alaska. And obviously, anyway, that purchase, because at the time all it's worth is a load of ice and a few polar bears, that purchase was known as Seward's folly. But I don't think you could say it was a folly. You think if Russia had still owned Alaska in the days of the Cold War, it could have been very awkward. So Seward's folly, not really total folly. Ulysses S. Grant, the top general, the victorious general from the Civil War, bit of a loner, not really a politician, sort of obliged to take the presidency, didn't want the presidency, didn't enjoy the politics. It's all rather sad. He tried very hard to protect civil rights. He tried to do the right thing. He's by now a lonely bachelor, not a bachelor, a lonely widower with a drink problem. And it's a very unhappy, he's a very unhappy, he dies a broken man with all these problems and financially bankrupt as well. So the end of the great general's life is not a happy one. And it might all have gone so much better. It could. The period of Reconstruction and getting things right was really rather unhappy. So I've got very little, virtually nothing to say now about Rutherford B. Hayes, who followed. James Garfield was a Unionist general, and he's the first, no, he isn't, Lincoln, he's the second president to be assassinated. He was assassinated within a few months of becoming president, so he doesn't actually have very long to achieve anything. That's probably why I'm not going to tell you very much about him. He's succeeded by his vice president, who was not really a very distinguished person, but did his best. The Civil Service Act was important, and its date is sort of parallel. We are having civil service reforms in this country. Throughout Europe, the civil service is actually being turned into, throughout the Western world, I suppose you could say, the civil service is becoming professionalized, and entry to it is becoming open. It is the jobs of running the country here and in Britain and in other countries in Europe are no longer jobs for the sons of the rich and important. They're probably still jobs for those who've gone to public school, but that's not quite the same thing. They're open to examination. In theory, they are open to merit. So, and that was quite an important. The other thing that he was very opposed to was what is pork spending. Spending if you are the senator for such and such an area, then the new motorway could come into your into your area. The new backing your own constituency at the cost of, so pork rolling or pork spending is, and he was sort of very heavily and professionally and really quite firmly against it. The slight weakness was that he himself had been in charge of the port of New York, the quartermaster of New York, and hadn't done too badly out of it. So he was against corruption, unless his own record was slightly different. On we go. Not much to tell you about Mr. Cleveland. He is the one who makes life rather difficult. How many presidents has the United States had? Well, Trump is the 45th, but Cleveland had it twice, and the habit set in of saying that he was two people. So we've actually only had 44 presidents of the United States, because one of them did the job twice separately. So he came back. Harrison, who came in between, I haven't got much to tell you except that he's the son of the previous Harrison, the one who lasted for a few months before dying. The second time round, Cleveland is struggling with another world depression. By now, the economics were against him, so he's not doing that well. This is a more distinguished one. This is, if you like to see it like that, and the Americans themselves certainly didn't like to see it like that, but this is the start of the American empire. The Americans are moving in on Cuba. They've gone to war with Spain. They didn't actually get Cuba, of course, but they did get other places, other Spanish places. Spain handed over to America Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. So, McKinley, the expansion of America as a global power. The open door to China happens under McKinley. I'm not going through that bit. He was re-elected, but he was assassinated very soon after the start of his second term, and his vice president steps into his shoes. He's assassinated by a Polish anarchist. Where is he? I'm looking for my resident anarchist. I've got him. So anyway, the assassination of McKinley can't be entirely a success, because the man who succeeded him, the man who was his vice president, was a really great one. He's one of the top American presidents. Back at the beginning, you all saw the figures in the mountain, and the fourth of those figures is Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, the start of the teddy bear. Not sure how much to give you of this, but basically he's a very distinguished, he's also extremely young. He's 43 when he became president. So he's young and active. He has established his reputation as being a rough rider in this war with Spain, in the fightings for Cuba and so on. He is also hugely adventurous. So he's a widower when he became president, and he remarries, and so he's brilliant with the press. He is the first president to really get the media on his side. And it's a big operation, which was never quite, the people who followed were not as successful as he was. Foreign policy, where are we going? Square deal. All sorts of moves towards a fairer world. Fairness for labour. Trust busting. Expansion of the railways. Setting up the Department of Commerce and Labour. He used executive orders. This is American presidents have generally done things by passing legislation or getting He has a power, and he used it more than most previous presidents, to get things done on an executive order. Pure Food and Drugs Act, meat inspection, and he's heavily into conservation. The first national parks, the popularization of the forests and monuments, the building of dams, the improvement of America out wild, the use of America's wild countryside, and things are moving forward, getting these things under control. Just bear in mind, this is a country that doesn't like too much government. And he is putting government across the whole country in all sorts of ways. But to me, I suppose probably to a European way of seeing things, he's a sort of a great man. His foreign policy confirmed the presence of America on the world stage. He settles the border between Alaska and Canada. He gets involved in Panama, setting up the Canal Zone, taking it from Colombia. He's the first president during his term of office to go abroad. And gosh, he went abroad. He starts slightly easier, because I suppose, but we're not flying quite yet. Where are we? Panama helped that he was involved in the Algeciras conference, which is sorting things between France and Germany as we move towards the First World War. He's involved in the Hague Tribunal on Venezuela. He reasserted the Monroe Doctrine, you Europeans keep out of our area. He went on a tour of the world in the Great White Fleet. He used the American Navy to do a world tour. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating in the war between Japan and Russia. The war between Japan and Russia, which humiliated and nearly brought Russia to her knees. Russia came close to revolution when it found itself losing to Japan, which is after all a barbaric, West Eastern, unheard of, nowhere place in those days, and Russia was disgraced. Anyway, he steps in, and by now Japan is actually, none of what I just said was true of Japan, it was just the way things were seen, sort of the nonsense of the Mikado, but Japan is now asserting itself. Sadly, he fell out with his own chosen successor, his vice president, who became his successor, and he became re-involved set up a third party, the Bull Moose Progressive Party, and stood again in 1912. That decision to stand against his vice president divided American politics and let in Woodrow Wilson. So, third-party problems, if you like. I don't wish to influence anybody's vote, but vote with your conscience. He opposed, in other words, he was backing Wilson, except Wilson, we'll come to in a moment, Wilson stood on the policy of neutrality in the First World War, and Roosevelt actually was quite keen to side with the Allies, whom America eventually did back. Right, Taft had been, again, a number of these people who'd served quite well, but his presidency turns out to be somewhat undistinguished. He is out of tune with the progressives. All the progressive stuff that I've just given you from Teddy Roosevelt, he's slightly out of tune. He can't keep up. He's nowhere near as successful as Roosevelt in managing the press and the media and remaining a popular figure, so he loses out there. And then when Roosevelt stands against him, we come to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a new phenomenon. I suppose the closest you could get to him is possibly Jefferson. Woodrow Wilson is an intellectual. Woodrow Wilson is an academic. He's a university professor. I haven't given you a university professor so far. I've given you generals and full-time politicians. Woodrow Wilson comes through. I'm not doing the first bit, but I do want to mention the fact that the prohibition, the temperance movement, is taking off during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and we are moving towards prohibition. The opposition to prohibition comes from various quarters. One of the very unpopular and not helped by the First World War, the booze market, or the lower end of booze market, the beer end of the booze market, is controlled by the Germans. Well, in 1917, 18, we all know what we think of the Germans. So that managed to help the popularity of prohibition, which was finally passed by a 17th amendment in Wilson's last January. I haven't finished with Wilson. We go on slightly. I've said he was neutral in the first few years of the First World War. His second election is based on keeping America out of the war, but by 1917, events have turned things, and he gets involved in the First World War in order to make the world safe for democracy. The U-boat campaign, in particular, is thinking of the Lusitania. The Zinoviev, no, not the one, there's a telegram, there are all sorts of messages which are used, and they get involved. And of course, they turned the tide of the First World War. Anybody looking at the First World War would have to acknowledge that we probably wouldn't have won it without the arrival of the American troops, and the balance changed completely. At the end of the First World War, in the peace treaties, you have the big three meeting at Versailles. The big three are Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau for France, and Lloyd George for Britain. The fourth member of the big three, as I used to say when I was teaching this stuff, the fourth member of the big three is Orlando of Italy. And there they are in the bottom right-hand corner. You have France going for revenge to punish the naughty Germans. You have Lloyd George also sloganizing a bit about punishing the naughty Germans, also sloganizing about building homes fit for heroes, but actually going to have one hell of a struggle with the economics of the situation, and the arrival of another party, and the fact that he's the leader of only half of a minority party in the first case. So Lloyd George has got a pretty big struggle coming up. Woodrow Wilson goes across there with brilliant ideas for the future, the 14 points. If you don't know about the 14 points, they are so idealistic that they may not be realistic, but they are that nations should have, each nation should have its own country. That we will have no more secret treaties. We will have no more sort of all the things that had caused the First World War. And above all, we'll have a new organization to keep the peace. We will have an organization for all the nations of the world, the League of Nations. This is the predecessor of the United Nations. And what happens? America fails to join it. He himself had a stroke. There's a funny little period in which nobody is in charge. Mrs. Wilson seems to have been at least partway in charge for the last few months of Wilson's presidency. A great president in the sense that of his ideals, his ideas, what he stood for and what he believed in was very impressive. A successful president insofar as his contribution to the First World War succeeds and some of his reforms go through. But an unfortunate, very sad end, and an even sadder end when his big ideals give way to the fact that America goes through a period of deep isolationism where it could have done so much good in the world in the 20s and 30s, and it focused on itself. Right, I have very little to tell you about these three. The first one, we're now reacting against the ideals of Wilson. We're going back to sort of a Republican We will have no more big government, no more government running everything. We'll have no more American involvement in foreign affairs. We will allow business to get on with it. In capitalist terms, this is a golden age. And I tell you it, we've got the roaring 20s. We have a huge boom in the first part of the 20s. We are now selling cars, like Henry Ford is actually flogging cars, and you can have them any colour as long as they are black, and all that stuff. We have films. It's the takeoff of the entertainment business. It's the start of Hollywood, but it's also the start of gramophones and music. It's the start of so many things. The 20s. We're about to enter the 20s again. Will it mean the same thing? Because you know what the 20s mean, and America is at the heart of everything to do with the 20s. These presidents are at the heart of it. Harding was probably not an undistinguished man, but he gets involved in scandals, and he gets himself out of the scandals by having a heart attack and dying. He is succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, whose most famous thing is that he's known as Silent Cal. He's the one where somebody placed a bet on him. I bet you can get more than you can't get more than 2 words out of the president, and he answers with the phrase, "He wins." But this is also the era of prohibition, and a popular story, there was an article quite recently saying that prohibition actually had done some good, and that the ideals of prohibition were worth examining. But the general picture, the general image, historical image of prohibition is that it was responsible for all the gangsters and the Al Capones. What is Al Capone using? He's using the new motor car. He's using the machine guns. He is taking advantage of the undercurrents of crime which go with prohibition, the speakeasies and the forbidden drinking places. Hoover, who follows, is in theory in the same tradition. But Hoover actually, if you go back into his past life, had been quite a successful, qualify a bit as a great man. During the war, he had done a lot for the homeless. He had actually done a lot in particular in Belgium, when Belgium was having a rough time. I mean, Belgium had a grim First World War. It was occupied by the enemy. And Hoover did a lot for refugees after the war. And so he was a distinguished rescuer of stranded Americans, of starving Belgians, and had been a successful Secretary of State for Commerce. Unfortunately, within months of his taking office, the Wall Street crash happened. And by contrast with what eventually was going to solve it, he didn't have the answers. But Hoover, in a sense, history was unfair to Hoover because he's a man who had done, despite even being a Republican, he had done quite a lot of good things. Right, we have the Wall Street crash, and the Depression was too much for him. We move on to Franklin Roosevelt. Again, one of my top 3 or 4. I don't know if you can work out which my top 3 and 4 are, because I can't do it myself generally. But I know I can't work out which of them is the greatest. This is definitely a candidate. So he promised a New Deal. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And just the impact of his becoming the new president turned things around a bit, at least psychologically. His broadcast, just like his uncle Theodore, his handling of the media was brilliant. The Americans were reassured by his fireside chats. He spoke to them regularly. But above all, the 100 days of the New Deal, focusing on relief, recovery, and reform in the blue, I'm not going into it. It's a huge amount of government interference. These are government agencies, government initiatives designed to create jobs, designed to relieve the situation, making things, and it was, in the end, effective. After 2 terms, we have reached 1941, 1940. The world is at war. He's not involved. He is actually talking to Winston Churchill on the Prince of Wales, and we're beginning the Atlantic Charter and stuff, but the resolution is that America is staying out of this war. And he is re-elected, the first time that we have a president going for a third term, justified, I think, by the success of his first two, and the fact that he's still full of energy. And he has, a number of his achievements, and any of these people, is the people they've surrounded themselves with. There are a lot of great American politicians alongside FDR. So he's re-elected for a third term. Within months of the election of his election for a third term, his neutrality is scuppered by the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. He's into a war, and our great peacetime reformer turns himself into a great war leader. And I think he can earn that title as a great war leader. Again, surrounding himself with some great generals. It all helps that they succeed, of course. But if we can go through that. By 1944, he stands for a fourth term, absolute record. Unfortunately, he wins it fairly comfortably. The war is very nearly over, and he dies in April. The war ends in May. So, just from the pictures, we ought to mention his wife, who is also an outstanding figure in the history, not just of America, but in terms of women's ability to use their position and achieve things for the less privileged. Eleanor Roosevelt, a great lady in her own right. Harry Truman, chosen to balance the ticket. Nobody's heard of him, nobody has any confidence in him, but this is a man who did step up to the plate and achieve a pretty great a measure of greatness, I think. Basically, our world, the world which has run most of our lifetimes, was created not just by him. Lovely article today in which Ernest Bevin is given huge credit for NATO. But FDR's underrated vice president, Roosevelt, dies within 3 months. Truman, who's been sort of stuck in his own little state, he's a senator for Missouri. His entire life has never sort of involved foreign policy. It's all. And now he's in charge of rebuilding the world. It is under him. He is the one who goes to Potsdam. Halfway through Potsdam, of course, Churchill gives way to Attlee, but he is now the representative on the world stage, having never been barely been on the stage at all. And he's now fully tested. He's the one who authorized the use of the atomic bomb. He's there. By 1947, the tensions with Russia are growing and growing. We are on the verge of this Cold War. The Truman Doctrine says that the United States will support free peoples to resist subjugation by armed minorities or other outside pressures and to work out their own destiny. This is where he finds himself supporting the people of the countries where, and this is the start, I suppose, of the domino theory. It is also, of course, above all, the start of NATO. One of the tests was the Berlin airlift. Even before that, yes, I should have been following my slide better, the Marshall Plan, using American dollars to rebuild Europe. The Berlin airlift, testing the Russian resolve, testing the NATO or the Western powers' ability to cope with it. We're moving on. Russia gets an atomic bomb. we move on towards the hydrogen bomb. We are moving very fast towards the Cold War. The Korean War, where he dismisses one of America's most successful generals, a huge test for an unknown former senator president. But it's the end of isolation. It's the start of America being the world policeman. In the Cold War, he won his own, and this was almost a surprise at the time. He won his own, he won a second term, the first in his own right in 1948, and he goes on. I knew this was going to happen. I'm going to cut off, just give you Eisenhower if you can spare. All right, we just have a bash at Eisenhower. He won his own term, turned the economy from wartime to peacetime. He tries to move towards civil rights. He's actually on the right side, on the liberal side, he's a supporter of civil rights. He banned segregation in the army and the civil service insofar as he could. So, I mean, there are places where that's very difficult, and he doesn't get it. He also faces this awful anti-communist Reds under the bed scare of McCarthyism, which is still living around, and as we move on to the next one. He is followed by the Supreme Allied Commander from the war, very successful general. I like Ike, and he, of course, at a level, he's the peacemaker in the sense that he brings about the armistice in Korea. He undermined McCarthy, the McCarthyism, the anti-communism, the worst of it at least, was brought to an end under Eisenhower. In doing this, I found myself recognizing some achievements from Eisenhower, which I hadn't previously sort of seen. I'd seen him as being an ineffectual president, but some of this is quite important and is in its own way an achievement. He didn't intervene in Hungary when Hungary tried to break away from the Soviet dominance, and he did not support Britain and France in the Suez catastrophe. This is when Great Britain has lost an empire and not yet found a role in the world. I think we might still be looking, I'm not sure. We shall certainly be looking in a few months' time unless we're very careful. He was prepared to go into Cuba, although it's his successor who picks up the tab. It's the start of a space race, although his successor picks up that tab and makes a bigger go of it. It is, and we start the domino theory. The Eisenhower doctrine extends the Truman doctrine to the Middle East. We are going to back, I suppose you might say it was just American interests, but it's an extension of we will support those who we like, we will support those who provide oil, or we'll support those who are on the democratic side, whatever, but a little bit complicated by the Zionist issue, perhaps. Right, I think that could be it. I'm afraid, when I move on to him, which I'm not going to do properly, but I do not think we can have a fair assessment. He had the potential to have been a great president. He also had the potential to have been, and really, in the end, the assassination cost him the chance of proving beyond. All right, the Cuba Missiles crisis is a triumph. The declaration that we're going to put a man on the moon is a triumph. But whether we can count JFK as a great president is something that we are deprived of because he didn't get fully tested, is the way I would see it. I am, as I thought I might be, going to have to stop. Come to history in the spring, and you can have the rest of them. But most of you, in fact, all of you except Ben, can remember the rest of it anyway.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, didn't speak into it enough. Anybody, any questions for Andrew before we go? I thought there would be. What a surprise.
Thank you, Andrew. I thought that was a lovely run-through. And I take your point about Ben being young enough not to remember this lot. You mentioned that you saw a few of the people you've talked about were amongst the greats.
Mm-hmm.
Would you put anyone after Kennedy amongst the greats?
I would love to have put Obama as being, and I can't.
I agree.
But when he came, when he was, his inauguration, I spoke about inaugurations, I was as excited as everybody else about it. He is still for 11 years, he has been the most popular American of any in the American opinion polls. That's a quick answer to a difficult question.
Yeah,
is it right that they're restricted to 2 terms now?
Yes.
When did that change then from, because one of the early ones served 3 or 4 terms?
No, the only one who served more than 2 is Roosevelt, and it was revenge from the Republicans. We're not having this, and it's in the 50s. It's probably under Eisenhower that an amendment was passed that nobody could stand for more than 2 terms. There are variations. You could get up to nearly 12 years if a vice president had less than 2 years of his predecessor's term. He could go for 2 terms, so that would take him up to 10 years. But no, it's interesting with my perspective that Roosevelt is one of the greats, and one of the greats into his 3rd and 4th terms. Because, sort of why deprive yourself of a great man and go for somebody lesser? It might even have applied to, I might have been able to answer your question if Obama had been allowed to go a little bit longer. He needed a bit more support in the houses, wouldn't he? Yeah, in Congress.
Thank you, Andrew. Just saying how fascinating all that was. I'm just looking back to the non-intervention for so long to becoming the world's policeman. Mm-hmm. Do you feel they're almost hoisted with their own petard now, that they are in fact going to almost assume a responsibility now, frightening that it is, for world peace?
I think it's impossible to answer that question while the present incumbent is there, because I don't think he would know how to answer it. And I think there's a serious danger he'll be there for another 4 years, which will mean that the question becomes even harder to answer. To an extent, his being there is part of their being hoisted with their own petard, perhaps. I mean, a lot of the sort of a vast majority of the people who voted for this man have no interest in world affairs. And so I don't know. But to foresee the future when you've got Trump in office is pretty hard work. And it won't be any easier with some of our choices of Prime Minister either, but never mind.
Magnificent talk, Andrew. Thank you. A very quick question, easy to answer. Do you think American presidents have too much power? In the sense that I think the figure is with Trump, there are something like, is it 7,000 to 8,000 appointees under his gift? Do they have too much power? The executive orders and all the rest of it? What's your view?
I think the present situation tells us that they may well have too much power that money has too much power. I should have delivered under Eisenhower. Eisenhower warned his successors against the military-industrial complex becoming too powerful. Very significant from a general to say that the military-industrial complex is hugely powerful. There are whole ways in which the American president's power is enormously limited. How can I say that the American president's too powerful when I think that Obama might have been a great president and he is stopped? He's just not. He's powerful enough to win office from a very unlikely beginning, a brilliant, sort of how he got in there. He was unable to change the situation, so I can't say that they're too powerful. I do think money is too powerful. I do think in the background there's a mythology about capitalism and Western values and so on. If I'd got to Jimmy Carter put human rights as part of the agenda. Well, we all agree with that. We all wanted it. But it hasn't necessarily benefited the American policing of the world. It's too complicated. I hope that's a sort of answer. Not very satisfactory.